Localizing your applications is of great importance, especially of course when you have users in different countries or you're targeting users that don't necessarily speak the same language as the basic language in which you may be creating your application. And this is something that most applications that you want to put out there in the stores should include. Because eventually, of course, your applications are not only going to be used by, for example, English speakers or Spanish speakers. You want your application to show the language that your users most commonly use, or at least the language that their phones have set. So I want to show you something real quick in here. There are, of course, some things that you don't really need to localize anymore, that are already quite localized for you. The operating system is doing its thing. And so, by the way, for this example, I'm going to be using again our expenses application. And what I want to show you in here is that, again, there are some things that are already localized. If in this application, for example, we navigate over to the date picker, right now, if my phone is in English, which it's the case, we're going to see, of course, this localized for English. But let me go ahead and show you what happens if first I close my application and then I go over to the settings, search for language and input, and change the language to be Spanish. Now I have Spanish for Mexico listed in here. All I have to do is move it over for this to be the first language. Notice that Android immediately changes the language. But let's go ahead and take a look at what happens with our application. If we now open the expenses application, of course, this is still going to be in English. Android is not going to automatically localize our application. We see that the button still reads button, the categories are still in English, the export button is still in English. But that control that is coming pretty much from the operating system is now in Spanish. And in this particular case, it even changes the order from month and then day and then year to first the day, then the month, and then the year. And if we open the calendar, we see that this is in Spanish. Even the buttons down here are already in Spanish. So there are some things that the operating system already does because these controls are actually coming from there. But of course, most of the application is still not in the language that the user may expect. So, what we're going to be doing in this and the next few lectures is going to be localizing our application. And we're going to be doing it using Xamarin Forms, so these will apply pretty much to both Android and iOS. But again, most of what we're going to be doing is going to be happening in the .NET Standard library. Let's get started right away. What I will do is first create a folder inside of my expenses app project. This folder, let's call this resources. And in this resources folder, what I want to do is add a new file. Now notice that in Visual Studio for Mac, in the MIS tab, we're going to find a resource file, which is going to create a regex resource file. This is the first type of file that we have to add. Eventually, by the way, we're going to be continuing to use XML files. But the first file has to be a regex file. So it's going to work like this. You're going to have a default language, which is going to be established in the regex file. And all of the strings for that language are going to be in this type of file. But any other language that you want to support will be established on an XML file. So all of the other strings for all of the other languages would be on XML files. This, of course, will be clearer once we have the example ready, but let's go ahead and create the resource file for now, and I will call this app resources. And what is going to happen, notice, is that this particular template for the regex file is going to create an XML file, which is why all of the other languages are going to be coded in an XML file, but it is also going to be creating a CS file, so an app resources.designer.cs file. This is only needed once for one language, for the default language. All of the other languages do not require this. That is why we won't need this template. But let's go ahead and take a look at this regex file. This is actually an XML file. Notice that by default we're going to have some headers and some values. What we will need is one data for each of the strings that we are using inside of our application. So here's what I mean. Let's say that the first page that I want to translate, and let me go ahead and close all of this and navigate to one of my views. Let's navigate over to the categories VM. So we'll start with the categories view, but the reason why I'm here on the VM is because here we are creating the categories. And we are creating them with a hard-coded string, which means that we cannot really translate this. We would have to make many evaluations. It's just not how we should do it. What we should do is get these strings over here on the regex file. And eventually over here on C#, just access the resources, not hard code a string. So let's start with the first category. This is going to be the housing category. What we will need, and by the way, I'm assuming here that the default language is going to be English. Eventually, we're going to be adding more resources. But what we will do is first define a data element. And the data element is going to require a name. This is how we're going to be identifying each of the strings that we will eventually be able to translate. So it is going to be, because of that, very important that you have some kind of naming convention that is going to make it easy for you to identify one resource from another. For example, if this is the housing category, we can name this housing category, which is very straightforward. And the actual string that will be used will be inside of the value element. And inside of the value, in this case, we're going to have housing, because this is going to be the English version. This is everything that is required for each of the data values. Now, optionally, and something that may be very useful in some scenarios, you can set a comment. And this comment is really oriented to a translator. So whoever is translating your application may need a little bit more context about this particular data element, so they translate it correctly. So you may add some small comment that is going to be helpful when they translate this to another language. For example, in this case, I'm letting them know that this string is the name of one of the categories. This again is going to be providing more context to a translator, so they know the best way to translate this string to a specific language. This comment is optional, it's not required and won't ever be displayed to the user. This is just for the translator creating a different app resources file for another language. So you will need as many data elements as your application is going to be using. For example, in my case, I have 7 categories, so I will need 7 different of these just for the categories. So let me define the 7 right here, and I will simply go ahead and change, of course, the name and the value. So I have something like this. The name again is going to be the identifier, so it has always to be different for each of the data elements, and the value is the corresponding string, in this case in English. And I'm leaving the comments, but again, comments are optional. Now, normally, at least in my experience, the translation happens when you have the application finished, or at least a first version of the application almost ready to be distributed. That way, you can just hire, or your company can hire a translator once instead of many times, so they can translate the application in one sitting, or in just one iteration, instead of sending new revisions once in a while. But it's still a good idea to have all of the resources for all of the languages that you're going to support. So let me go ahead and add another app resource for another language. In my case, I'm going to be showing you this in Spanish. Just keep in mind that this is exactly the same thing that you would do for each of the languages that your app has to support. So in the resources folder that I have been using, I will create a new file. And again, this doesn't have, or actually won't be, a regex file from the resource file template. This will be a regex file, but it won't require the designer.cs file. So I will actually be using the empty XML file template. I will, though, have to make sure that this is called app resources.regex, just the same as my default language. However, For Xamarin Forms to identify this as the resources for another language, I do have to specify which language this is going to be the translation for in the name itself. And this has to follow, of course, the namings that you would identify for each language. You know, there's this naming convention that you have to use. So for example, for Spanish, I would write .es after app resources. For German, I would write the E. For French, I would write FR. For Spanish in Mexico, I would write ES-MX, like this. So hopefully you're rather familiar with this naming convention, and of course if you don't know the naming convention for a specific language, you can always search for it. I know, for example, that Portuguese is PT, but I wouldn't be sure what the naming convention for Chinese is, for example. My app resources is going to be applied for all Spanish, so it won't matter if this is Spanish from Mexico, from Argentina, from Spain. This is going to be general Spanish. So all I have to do is write .es. My file then is going to be app resources.es.resx.